Rachel, you took a trip to Kent to visit a focus group in a marginal constituency to hear their views on how things are going for Labour so far. Before we hear from them, just explain why this particular group of voters matter.
So these were 10 swing voters who all voted Conservative in 2019 and Labour in July. And we were in the constituency of Sittingbourne and Sheppey, which voted Labour by just under 400 votes, so a really tight marginal seat, and where Reform came third with over 25% of the vote. And all of the people in the focus group were either from that constituency or from neighbouring Kent constituencies that voted in a very similar way. And they also all identified as working class. So a very key voter group for kind of taking the temperature of how Labour is doing 3.5 months in.
And this is kind of an area then where pretty much everything is up for grabs.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they all said before the focus group that they were potentially open to Labour, Conservative or Reform in the next election, although obviously that's way in the future.
What was the mood in the room?
I think me and the guy running the focus group were not expecting them to be really positive and enthusiastic about Labour, but we were a bit taken aback by how punchy and how disappointed they were right from the beginning.
You immediately put your thumbs down when I said the new government. Why is that?
The first thing they did was go for the pensioners, which was whoever advised them on that was totally wrong, because it put everyone's back up completely. And yet he was going on about immigration and he's not mentioned it again.
It appears that they've lost the plot. They knew what they wanted to do when they came in, but unless their presentation skills are absolute rubbish. They haven't gone down their guided path, which they said they were going to do.
Labour's always been for the working man, and it seems, I know it is early days, but I haven't seen or heard of anything for the working man. They just seem to be going the opposite way.
Andrew, I don't think many in the Labour Party would be wanting to hear that. I mean, obviously Claire right at the beginning is referring to the decision to scrap the winter fuel payment.
And I don't think many people in the Labour Party, certainly in the Commons, would be surprised by any of that at all, because it's exactly the kind of message that MPs are getting all the time. I think everybody understands the damage now done by the winter fuel payment announcement, particularly coming alone as it did early in the lifetime of the government and then ahead of the freebie spectacles and so forth rows. The real question that somebody said there, it's early days, is whether this matters really if they get the message right now, if they learn this lesson and if they start to deliver. Now, what does deliver mean? That's really hard if there's not much money around. But it certainly means getting the waiting lists right the way down. If they can have a big impact on waiting lists and the NHS is appearing to be functioning again properly around much of the country, that will make a difference. If people look out of their windows and they can actually see new houses being built in land that was being kept aside by the planning system, that will make a difference. And they have to get money into the pockets of working families. And perhaps some of the new workers' rights legislation will help on that. There's a big argument around how employers will react. I think Morgan McSweeney, the Chief of Staff, and I think the people now around Keir Starmer, particularly people like Angela Rayner, really understand that they have messed up in terms of their early messaging and they have to change. It may not be too late.
It strikes me that just that introduction to the group, though, it shows, we've been saying it many times actually, but it shows just, yes, Labour scored a massive majority, but this is a very shallow support, isn't it? And it really could switch quite easily.
Yeah, and one of the things that came out throughout the focus group was people talking very freely about their lack of enthusiasm for Labour, both now but also when they voted. One man said that he thought really hard, which box should I tick? Am I doing the right thing? Some people were, as Andrew said, willing to say, let's see how it goes. It's early days. Let's see how it all pans out. But there were some in the group who had basically already decided that they had given Labour a chance and they thought that Labour had already blown that charge. Now, obviously, they may feel differently in 4 years' time, but the strength of feeling that the opportunity for Labour to prove themselves had already passed, that I think surprised me.
Well, let's go back to the group for a minute, because another major theme was that the state the country is in, the state of our public services. Very strong feelings about this in Sittingbourne.
Do you live in Sittingbourne? Well, you know how bad it is to get a doctor's appointment in Sittingbourne. It's probably about, I think it's the second or third worst place in the country because of the doctor-patient ratio.
Whether it be social services, whether it be any, like to adults, to children, that everyone was overrun in the COVID times. Now we're trying to deal with the fallout of that. Therefore, we need to get some money into the educational system, the mental health system, and also the NHS.
Sharon,
my son's desperate for a school. He's now disabled after being ill last year. Can't get into a school for love nor money. Now, that's the system in Kent as a whole
it's not very good.
failing. The SEN or Special Educational Needs Department is falling apart.
Andrew, we talked on the podcast yesterday about how difficult this budget is going to be, and especially Ben Zarenko from the Institute for Fiscal Studies was saying that health, Wes Streeting, the NHS is going to get some money, but that leaves less for everyone else. I mean, it's going to be hard to fix these kind of problems that they're talking about in Sittingbourne.
I don't think it's hard. I think it's completely impossible in the short term. I think that, the strategy, I think, is now fairly clear, which is you raise a lot of money for long-term investment and you start to give a sense of direction, that Britain moving again, money coming in from overseas companies, houses being built, factories being built, a lot of money going on the green transition, pylons going up, all of that. So people can see change. But alongside that, they have to be able to feel a bit of change. You have to give them a down payment, if you like, early on. And I think it's quite clear the down payment is going to come through the NHS above all. And therefore, there's not going to be much down payment elsewhere. And that is going to be very, very hard politics for at least 1, maybe 2 years ahead.
Even with the NHS money that we're expecting to see next week, though, is it going to fix that kind of issue that we heard about there with getting an appointment with a GP?
It might start to do that because I think everybody understands that the IT system around the NHS is completely crazy. And just a relatively simple recalibration, so all GP surgeries are using the same kind of system. I do think before too long, whatever the freedom of information campaigners say, we will all have our entire medical records on an app on our phone. That's what they're promising. And that will make moving around from GP, getting hospital appointments much easier. I think what they're going to do on the NHS is they're going to spend most of the money on these, as it were, so-called Formula One fast turnaround operations, where you're doing operations almost on a conveyor belt to get people off the waiting lists.
Things like cataracts, I presume.
Yeah, simple operations. Well, hip replacements. I mean, you've got an orthopedic surgeon or two on standby, and they work round the clock. They work long shifts, and you've got nurses coming in and out, and you're turning around. You're using the same operating theatres again and again and again. And just as a car comes in Formula One, you change the wheels very quickly. It comes into the pit stop. You can do the same kind of thing, it's said, in operations. I don't know if this is simplistic. It sounds it as I say so, but they believe that they could actually get the number of operations much, much more quickly through the NHS. That's what they're going to spend the money on. So therefore, there's no money in the short term for social care. There's no money in the short term for these very, very important primary care hubs. And I think Wes Streeting is going to have to open a few of those as trials around the country. Again, show, not tell. This is what we're going to do more of.
Another thing that I think should really worry Labour is that no one was buying the line that the inheritance left by the Conservatives was worse than expected. They understood that the public finances were not in a good state, but there was sort of widespread consensus that Labour probably knew about this in opposition. They should have known about this in opposition. If they didn't, then that was their own fault. And therefore, the message that there wasn't enough money and that there wasn't enough resources for more spending, they really didn't take the excuse of that at all. One guy said, you vote Labour because you want more spending. I understand that there isn't a lot of money, but that is the entire point of voting Labour. So Rachel Reeves' balancing act, the sort of messaging that she's been trying to do since when she first got in July, saying, oh my goodness, there's no fiscal headroom at all, zero resonance with these voters.
Well, that's interesting because you looked her in the whites of the eyes and you thought she was absolutely telling the truth, didn't you?
I do. I think it's going to be extremely tough, and I think people are going to notice and feel that sting, as it were, in the budget. And then it's going to be clear where her political priorities are. I think, generally speaking, this is going to be a more traditional Labour budget and a more traditional Labour government, perhaps, than most people expect.
As we've been hearing, Labour are not in the good books for this swing seat of Sittingbourne. But could these voters be persuaded back to the Conservatives? Rachel, were they particularly enamoured with either Kemi Badenoch or Robert Jenrick?
In a word, no. There had been basically zero cut through with the Conservative leadership race. No one really said they were paying attention. They didn't seem to know who Robert Jenrick was particularly. Kemi Badenoch, they knew, but only because of her comments on maternity pay, which
Really?
one person, that they'd heard of, and one person said that was bonkers. So, very, very little cut through there. And I think none of them said that they would consider voting Conservative again at the next election. Again, obviously, it's 4 years in the future. A lot can change, but they didn't feel remotely inspired. And they thought both the candidates to be the Tory leader were really too right-wing for them to ever consider.
Well, that's quite good news for Labour, I suppose, Andrew.
It is. I mean, I think we have to keep saying, we're sitting here. We don't know whether Kamala Harris or Donald Trump is going to be the next US president. We don't know what's going to happen in Ukraine. Things are changing day by day. 4 years' time, the whole world is going to seem so different. I think these exercises are really useful to give a government a sense, or an opposition party, a sense of how they're doing in the country. But I think they tell us absolutely nothing really about the next election. There's too many variables.
No, I would agree with that. But it was interesting to kind of get a sense of just the vibes towards some of the key political figures. And the conversation about the Tory leadership race did prompt somebody else's name to come up.
You've got two really right-wing candidates that want to take over the Conservative Party. You might as well vote for, if they get in, you might as well vote for Nigel.
You've already mentioned, Rachel, that Reform got 25% of the vote in the general election. I mean, how many of these voters feel tempted that they might lend their vote to Reform next time?
Well, I should say that this area should be a Reform target seat. Reform got 19% of the vote or over in just over 100 constituencies, and many of those are clustered on the Kent or the Essex coastline. So Nigel Farage's seat of Clacton is just a bit north of Sittingbourne and Sheppey. There's a Reform MP in Thurrock that's nearby. This should be key Reform territory, and the area as a whole voted Brexit overwhelmingly in 2016. So I was expecting there to be a fair amount of support for Reform and Farage. And interestingly, the group was really split on that. Some women said that they had basically decided that they would vote for Reform next time. But there was, as you heard in that clip there, a sense that Reform were a bit too right-wing, the Conservative leadership candidates were a bit too right-wing, and some people raised the fact that they didn't think that Farage was being entirely honest about immigration, or that his focus on immigration meant that they didn't feel that the party had a strong enough offering on other areas. So I would be very surprised if Reform didn't try and make headway in that seat and that area. But it's not as straightforward as you might think just from looking at the voting proportions.
I think there are two things to look at when we're talking about Reform at the moment. What Reform does as it evolves, and how Labour deals with immigration. Immigration, whatever we think, is still a massive, massive issue for an awful lot of voters in the country.
It came up all the time, didn't it?
It came up with the budget. It came up with how Labour has started in its first 3.5 months. It came up in basically every stage of the conversation.
And it's not just us. This is an issue completely upending the politics of the entire European continent at the moment. And I think, looking at what I've heard and listened to and read, I think Labour are a million miles away yet from having a credible, understandable and effective policy on illegal migration, or even legal migration as well. It's not clear what they really think about it, whether they are still the sort of slightly kind of more open borders, we're a migration society, it's very good for our economy kind of party, or whether they're a much more, haul up the drawbridge kind of party. They're a long, long way away from doing that. There is going to be a massive row inside the Labour Party, inside the Labour government, before they settle on an immigration policy. And that is absolutely the crucial question when we talk about Reform. Except that, of course, Reform has agency too. And I think Richard Tice in particular had the beginnings of a very interesting sort of populist policy on other issues. He was, for instance, going to forgive income tax for NHS doctors and nurses. There are lots of interesting sort of populist policies. If Reform is able to evolve in that direction, and I'm not sure they have the personnel to do so, but if they are, then they could become a very, very powerful force at the next election.
As an aside on that, the Health Secretary has launched the largest national conversation ever this week on NHS reform, and he's inviting comments from the public. And actually, I was scrolling through it. I looked at hundreds of them, and actually one of the top ones, it's not income tax, but it's forgiving student debt for nurses in particular, to encourage them to come and work in the NHS. Yeah. It's got a lot of support. Coming back to the here and now, early month not gone down well with this group of voters. But what do they think about, the actual people in the Labour Party, in this Labour government, in the cabinet?
Words used to describe Starmer: woolly, evasive, a typical politician, not necessarily descriptors that would surprise anyone who's been following Starmer. One person called him boring, for example. But I think more worrying was a sense that he just wasn't in a position to get the struggles, the cost of living crisis, and in particular the struggles of the working class. And really interestingly, given Starmer's own working class background and the fact that he has talked about it, I would say a fair amount, like a lot of his conference speech was talking about his own background. They thought that he was out of touch, and in particular his title being a sir, that came up as a sign that he couldn't possibly get the stuff that they were dealing with on a day-to-day basis.
He comes across as very woolly, a very typical politician, ducks the answers, will never give a direct answer. So from that point of view, I'm afraid I don't think he comes across very well. I don't think he does himself any favours whatsoever. And I totally agree with your comment about being a sir. And I think people will stop and think, actually, he's a step above us.
Andrew, we were talking on the podcast yesterday about how Angela Rayner has been brought in closer to the heart of government, and how you thought that was a clever political move.
I did. Somebody very close to Keir Starmer said to me, the thing about Angela is she reaches voters that the rest of us can't get anywhere near. People hear her voice, they hear her story, and they really relate to her. And we are not a government that can let people like that go, be anywhere except at the centre. So I think they're very much aware. And I think we may be moving towards a style of government where people talk a lot about Starmer as being a little bit like Harold Wilson. I think probably the ambition is Starmer a little bit like Claire Matley, the kind of quiet chair of the government, sitting slightly in the shadows, keeping everyone on message, keeping everyone together, the authority figure, but not at the front of the pitch, as it were, changing my metaphor, scoring goals and playing so much. And I think we're going to see much more use of people like Wes Streeting, Angela Rayner, Ed Miliband and others as the public face of the government.
It's interesting that you make that point about Angela Rayner being able to reach voters that other people can't reach, because they did like her, or at least they said that they had liked her. But, you'll hear there's almost a sense of betrayal towards her about what has happened since Labour got into government.
I quite like listening to her at the beginning. I must admit, when she first started talking, you'd hear her talking on the radio, and I thought, actually, it was a bit of a breath of fresh air. Someone actually seems like they're coming from the coal mouth, so to speak. And then, again, you get the political whips in the background, say this, do this, this is policy. And then you can see that their language and terminology changes. They've gone not in power. They're talking really well, and it sounds like they're just talking to us willy-nilly in the pub, having a pint. And then all of a sudden it's that kind of the business face comes in.
Do you think they just need a bit more time, Andrew? Because we when you look at this current Labour government, it's the most state-educated government. It's so different to what we've had for the last 14 years. And yet the people, the people who share their working class background are just not buying it.
I think, first of all, there is such a rooted distrust of government and the ruling people in general in this country, as it were, the blob, whatever you call it, that is not going to shift quickly or easily. But yeah, you're quite right. This is also a very green government. I mean, if you listen to the voices, you listen to Bridget Phillipson's voice, you listen to Rachel Reeves's voice, South London, lower middle class accent. She's not posh. And Starmer sometimes sounds posh because he's, as it were, had to reshape himself in the world of law and as DPP and all the rest of it. But you can hear the accents there. This is not a government of posh people, but it is a government. And that's the problem. This is still, as it were, the state authority decreeing what's available and what isn't available, what is affordable and what is not affordable. And that great big state forefinger wagging is what people really dislike.
Rachel, I think the people of Sittingbourne are reflecting, aren't they, this wider malaise of the British public with politicians and politics. Was there any sense of hope? Is there anyone that they would like to govern us?
Well, I think you're right that there was a general sense of disillusionment. and they talked about all politicians being crooked, how you have to make deals to get in. And that was true of Labour, the Conservatives, and even some suspicion of reform there. One guy said, basically, you're going to have to rip the whole system apart and start again from scratch, kind of talked about proportional representation or getting rid of Parliament and all kinds of things like that. But yes, at the end, they were asked if there was anyone from outside politics that they thought could, come in and inject some fresh life and breath of fresh air into Westminster. And here's what they said.
If there was one person from outside of politics who you think would make a good Prime Minister or leader should be more like, could be a celebrity,
Martin Lewis.
Martin Lewis. Why?
Martin votes for that name.
I think he'll make a good chancellor.
The minute Martin Lewis comes in as Prime Minister and takes a decision that people don't like, he'll be just as unpopular as the rest of them, I'm afraid. The point about people offering advice online or in the media is that it's just advice. It's always helpful. They're never the people who say no. And in government, very often, as we're discovering right now, they are the people who say no. And that's why, particularly in a period which feels relatively demoralised and impoverished, they're so unpopular.
Yeah, I think, Martin Lewis's job, as it were, is to help people save money.
Even in bad times.
Even in bad times. The second he was responsible for making a decision that cost them money, that popularity would go out the window. But I think there is a point about his very clear communication style that maybe politicians could learn from, and the understanding directly how a government decision will affect somebody's individual finances. I think that's important. Other names that came up, they mentioned Jeremy Clarkson, which I think is probably not that surprising. But there was also one political figure who there was sort of slightly warmer sentiment about, and that was Andy Burnham. And one of the things that someone said about the Labour Mayor of Manchester was that he was able to be more authentic and to kind of get stuff done because he was out of Westminster and he was a mayor rather than an MP. So, maybe there's a message there about the devolution of power as well.
I think that's really interesting because I think people who are outside the Westminster hierarchy and game, as it were, have a certain authority and sense of themselves and confidence, therefore, that other people don't. Andy Burnham is a very, very good example. He always sounds like he's thinking on his feet. He's got very positive and clear things to say. The other example, perhaps less well known in England, is Anas Sarwar, who's the leader of the Labour Party in Scotland, and again has that kind of bouncy self-confidence that you don't hear very quickly after people become members of the cabinet.